Audiobook Academy. Book Summary. Walden and Civil Disobedience. By Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau's Walden and Civil Disobedience, a collection of 2 of his essays, is included in this book. Published in 1854, Walden, possibly Thoreau's best-known work, is arguably his most enduring. Originally published as Walden, or Life in the Woods, the novel had considerable popularity following its introduction, but only sold 2,000 copies in the first 5 years of its existence before being discontinued. Upon Thoreau's death in 1862, however, the book was reprinted and received more favorable reviews. It has been hailed as an American classic by a growing number of academics. The book tells the story of Thoreau's time living in the woods near Concord, Massachusetts. Thoreau lived alone in the woods for 2 years and 2 months, attempting to subsist off the earth in Walden Pond, a nearby body of water. As he discovers more about himself and the world around him, he writes about it in the book. In 1849, Resistance to Civil Government, Civil Disobedience, was published under the title Civil Disobedience. To understand Thoreau's ideas on the individual's commitment to his conscience, one must read his article. Thoreau's anti-slavery sentiments and the Mexican-American War are prominent themes in this essay. Thoreau begins the book by laying out his 2-year experiment in a nutshell. He intends to live in a cabin near Concord, Massachusetts' Walden Pond for the duration of the experiment. The experiment has already been accomplished by the time the narrative begins. When Thoreau returned to civilized life, he had spent 2 years and 2 months in the wilderness. Friends and acquaintances expressed their concerns about his safety in the woods, his ability to stay warm in the winter, and their surprise at his desire to live alone in the forest for an extended period of time, all without the benefit of human company. He claims that the purpose of this experiment is to discover the advantages of a more simple existence. It is his intention to retell the simple existence that he lived for those 2 years so that readers can see the benefits and perhaps choose it for themselves in this novel. He argues that having too many things just serves to drain us spiritually and physically due to the amount of time and effort it takes to earn enough money to buy them. In Thoreau's view, farmers are essentially enslaved to their farms, and those who earn more than they need for basic survival are enslaved as well. Shelter, food, clothes, and fuel are the only necessities that nature cannot provide for humans. One can survive off the earth without these 4 things if they are ready to embrace everything else that nature has to offer. Thoreau recalls the construction of the modest cottage in which he lived for these 2 years. He borrowed the axe he needed to chop down trees and began from scratch. To ensure he would never owe anyone money, he sharpened the axe before returning it. The spring months are a busy period for Thoreau as he begins work on the house, sometimes purchasing materials and other times receiving them as gifts. July 4, 1845, is the day he completes the mansion and declares independence from social norms and practices. Thoreau meticulously notes all of his financial and credit information as he works on the book. While living in Walden, he ate a diet of beans, peas, maize, and potatoes. Thoreau was able to save $32 in his first 8 months in the bush by eating so sparingly. As a result, the total cost of the housing and lifestyle for the first 8 months is only $27. Thoreau thinks this is a great deal. To avoid constricting social relationships, Thoreau wanted to live distant from any post office. When Thoreau moves into the mansion on Independence Day, he proclaims himself king of all of you, paraphrasing a famous poet. Although the house still lacks insulation and a chimney, he feels like an Olympic deity. He claims that if you look hard enough, you can find a paradise suited for the gods wherever on earth. Although Thoreau's house is technically incomplete, he sees the lack of insulation as a blessing since it will allow him to enjoy the cool summer breezes, and the absence of carvings and ornamentation will allow him to carve out the very environment of his soul. When he's not in his own home, sitting on a simple wooden chair, he loves to be somewhere else. The fact that he no longer has to bother about what time it is has made him feel liberated from both social and temporal limitations. Time is a river, and I go fishing in it, he said. He encourages the readers of this book to persevere until they reach the bottom of their own personal realometer, which he refers to as the way by which we can determine the truth of any situation. By saying that we should not rely just on what we learn in the classroom, Thoreau encourages us to get out into nature and observe things with our own eyes. Nature and the sounds around us are important to him, and he often listened to the sparrows outside his house. The only thing keeping him awake was the scream of modern society, represented in this case by the Fitchburg Railroad, which happens to pass right by his house. On Sundays, Thoreau hears the church bells and frets that the humor and intelligence of the nature-loving man may be lost forever, despite his praise for the businesslike ardor of industry. His home is filled with the sounds of nature, even though he doesn't have any animals. While walking in the chilly temperature and listening to the bullfrogs and other night animals, he describes an evening that he calls wonderful. Visitors had left modest gifts on his doorway when he arrived home. Even though his nearest neighbor is only a few hundred feet away, he feels like he's in a completely different country. Despite his loneliness, he enjoys spending time alone with nature. The 3 seats in Thoreau's residence are there for guests because he enjoys occasional company. However, he is acutely aware of its confined size. In the story, he asserts that individuals, like nations, must have proper broad and natural bounds. He likes to meet with visitors in the woods when they come to visit. It is not uncommon for him to forget to provide his guests with food or drink because he is more concerned with their spiritual well-being. And he does get a lot of visits. Nobody comes to him for an insignificant task because of his location, and the more important visitors are isolated from the rest of those in attendance. Though the number of visitors has increased and the quality of the discourse has greatly improved, he maintains that things are going well. Thoreau also encounters a fair number of wanderers and vagabonds, whom he regards as fascinating. In spite of his dislike for beggars since they rely solely on charitable donations. In addition, Thoreau is an abolitionist, and he frequently aids slaves on the Underground Railroad, as he calls it. Alex Therrien, a French-Canadian woodsman, was a close friend of Thoreau at the time. Thoreau held Therrien in high regard despite his lack of formal education, admiring his carefree attitude and ability to pass the time amusing oneself. Even while Walden Pond appears gloomy and filthy from the outside, Thoreau claims that Therrien's mind is as deep and bottomless as Walden itself. Thoreau also believes that women and children appreciate nature the most since they are free from the burden of making a living that men who work have to contend with. It's not uncommon for Thoreau to come across arrowheads and pottery fragmented when working in his garden. As evidence, he believes an extinct nation had previously occupied this country, and hence to some measure, had drained this same crop's soil prior to the arrival of white settlers. Thoreau can hear military drills from a town far away across the field where he produces his vegetables, and it makes him reflect on how remote he feels from any battle. When it comes to farming these crops, Thoreau's primary goal is not to provide sustenance but rather to practice self-discipline. Rather than cultivating a crop, he claims, the goal is to cultivate himself. Thoreau bathes in the pond every day after completing his morning tasks and then spends the rest of the day relaxing. To be abreast of local events, he makes the short hike into Concord many times every week. During these outings, Thoreau forgoes the temptation to shop. He must frequently return home in the dead of night, and while this initially worries him, he gradually comes to trust the journey back to Walden Pond and no longer fears it at night. Thoreau points out that many people become lost in the dark, but he doesn't see that as a terrible thing. According to him, only when one is lost can one come to terms with one's own thoughts and feelings. Thoreau is arrested for not paying a poll tax during one of these forays into Concord. Because Thoreau did not want to support a state that still practices slavery, he deliberately chose not to pay the tax. Following a single night in solitary confinement, Thoreau is released and able to return to his Walden Pond hut. During a downpour while fishing in the deep forest, Thoreau is forced to take cover in a cottage that appears to be empty, believing it to be abandoned. The shack, on the other hand, is the home of a poor Irish immigrant named John Field and his family. Field and Thoreau conversate about money management and how to get out of poverty, according to Thoreau, although many experts believe it reads more like a lecture. His departure from the family is clearly irritated by Thoreau's absence of any shared moments of delight, as he often does while discussing his social contacts throughout the novel. Because of his erroneous assessment, Thoreau incorrectly believes that Field is afraid to take risks and lacks the common sense and mathematical acumen necessary for understanding what Thoreau was trying to convey to him. According to him, inherited Irish poverty has been passed down to Field. Seeing a woodchuck on his way home from work, Thoreau is suddenly overcome with a strong desire to catch and eat it. Introspectively, he examines the contrast between his noble, spiritual self and his dark, savage self, and discovers that he appreciates both aspects of his character. After a while, Thoreau believes that those who are destined for greater intellectual pursuits move on to higher callings after a period of time spent in the woods. Because he has a leaning toward vegetarianism and believes that the consumption of animal flesh is in some way degrading, Thoreau, a talented fisherman, refuses to put his skills to use. For the same reason, He abstains from consuming any caffeinated beverages, including coffee, tea, and alcohol. The creatures who live in Thoreau's cabin begin to befriend him. Playing with the mice in his residence is a daily occurrence for him, and he has even managed to get one to eat cheese from his fingers. One of his favorite sights is Phoebe the robin, whom he has named, and a mother partridge with her young. A temporary well has been dug by Thoreau, where he likes to read after lunch. It turns out that many of the wild apples and chestnuts he wanted to gather for the village had already been harvested. He is briefly discouraged by this, but he manages to find enough food to last him for a time, and the changing colors of the autumn leaves keep him upbeat. A buddy of Thoreau's helps him build a chimney for his cottage at the end of the summer. When winter comes, he'll be happy it did, since the cabin will be freezing. Thoreau can walk on the frozen surface of Walden Pond and look down into the pond. The daily ritual of chopping firewood and remaining indoors as the snow falls begins to become a habit for Thoreau. As soon as the snow piles up, Thoreau clears a route to his house, but few people venture up there in the freezing temperatures to see him. This route into Concord used to be full with familiar faces to him, and he wonders where they've all gone. William Ellery Channing, the famed philosopher Amos Bronson Alcott, and Thoreau's friend and colleague writer Ralph Waldo Emerson all visit him in the forest, but none of these men are ever explicitly named in the work. Thoreau's daily water supply is becoming increasingly problematic as he must now cut through the ice of Walden Pond to reach the water below. On one of his walks, Thoreau notices fishermen bringing in larger fish than he'd expected to find in the pond that day. In order to disprove the common belief that Walden Pond is bottomless, he decides to conduct a scientific survey of its depth. With the help of a fishing line and a stone, he is able to determine the pond's depth to be approximately 100 feet. Thoreau's second winter at the cabin, a large number of town men came to cut and harvest ice from the mountains. When Thoreau points out, even though the ice will be spread around the world, it will eventually return to the pond as water freezes and melts. During the spring, the ice on the pond begins to melt, causing tremendous noises. It's not long until Thoreau is fishing again and looking out over the water and admiring his life's peacefulness. It would be the perfect death for him, he reasons. However, on September 6, 1847, Thoreau left his cabin for the final time. Thoreau reflects on his reasons for living on Walden Pond and his reasons for leaving, both of which he believes to be legitimate. Even though he enjoyed his cottage, he feels the need to travel more of the world before settling down. One final time, he complains about the American consumerist mentality. In relation to the serenity and love he discovered in the woods, he says, "Money is not required to buy on necessity of the soul." Despite Thoreau's admission that the average person reading this novel may not grasp it, he insists that the dawning of a new day and the rising of the sun mean that a new life is about to begin. Civil disobedience. Thoreau's beliefs on the American government and the individual's place in it are summarized in this short essay by the author. Here, Thoreau discusses the importance of putting one's conscience above one's need to obey the law. Slavery and the Mexican-American War are among the institutions that he slams in his book, which was written in the mid-1800s. Before he gets into his main points, Thoreau argues that the majority perspective in the country does not represent the most intelligent or well-informed citizens, but rather those who have the most political clout. He maintains that the first duty of an individual should be to their own conscience, not to obey the law only for the sake of obeying it. A corrupt government should never be allowed to dictate to its citizens what they can and can't do. He argues that while a person is not bound by an oath to eradicate the world's injustices, he does have an obligation to refrain from participating in those he observes. This involves not being a part of a corrupt organization, such as the government. Because of its policies on slavery and war, the United States government at the time met Thoreau's definition of a corrupt government. He does not advocate voting or appealing for change because he believes that the government is already too far gone for it to make a difference. In his opinion, there is nothing that can be done about it. He refused to pay taxes and spent a night in jail as part of his lifelong struggle against slavery. At a time when distancing oneself from the government was not common, he wiped his hands of the whole thing altogether. Because one cannot recognize the corruption if one is involved in it, Thoreau prefers his protest to pushing for reform in the government by joining it. It's a brief essay, but Thoreau also included some of his own poetry and social commentary to soften the harshness of the subject matter. Henrietta Lacks, the novel's only significant character, is Henry David Thoreau, who recalls events from his own perspective. A modest way of life and wise use of money are major themes in Thoreau's book, which makes him one of the most well-known proponents in this field. To this day, his ideas continue to inspire a new generation of freethinkers. As a nature lover, Thoreau is often overlooked in favor of his political significance. Thoreau is a staunch supporter of the idea that the typical person is capable of thinking for himself and questioning the rules and regulations established by the government before blindly following them. Standing up for his own morals and refusing orders he couldn't bear to carry out confirmed the American concept of conscientious objection, which has reemerged numerous times in American history, most notably during the Vietnam War years of the 1960s. As a 19th-century man, Thoreau's disdain for American consumerism and industrialization was well ahead of his peers, as were many of his ideas. Young Americans have been inspired by Thoreau's determination to give up the luxuries of modern life in order to pursue his ideals in the wilds of nature for more than 100 years. The possibility exists that he influenced American liberal and countercultural ideologies. Thoreau, on the other hand, held many views that would be called conservative by today's standards. When Thoreau criticizes his poorer neighbors for their lack of sophistication, the reader wonders if he is implying that only those who are well off or educated may find peace inside themselves. With the Field family and with Alex Therian, Thoreau plainly demonstrated that he had no intention to put himself on equal footing with the impoverished or unschooled, but rather that he wanted to be their teacher. Thoreau's bigoted remark that the Field's poverty is the product of a hereditary Irish poverty is maybe the most depressing remark. Thoreau, a well-known abolitionist, may have implied that only Anglo-Saxon immigrants are born with the ability to manage their money wisely and creatively by making this type of remark. With his poetic and lyrical tone and focus on nature's beauty, particularly the woods and pond, Thoreau's work is devoid of dialogue. It's clear that Thoreau wanted his writings to be widely read and digested for years to come, despite his assertion of a yearning for isolation. Thoreau, Henry David, was an American writer, philosopher, and naturalist who died in 1890. On July 12, 1817, Thoreau was born in Concord, Massachusetts, the son of a pencil maker and businessman. As a young man, he attended Harvard University and taught in Concord and Staten Island, New York, where he was well regarded. He stayed with Ralph Waldo Emerson, an American writer and philosopher, from 1841 to 1843, when he met Amos Brosen Alcott, an educator and philosopher, and literary critic Margaret Fuller. Later, he moved to a primitive cabin on the shores of Walden Pond, a tiny pond just outside Concord. When Emerson moved back and with him in 1847, he stayed there till then. Thoreau supported himself by working odd jobs around Concord, including gardening, carpentry, and land surveying. Most of his time was devoted to studying nature, contemplating philosophical questions, reading Greek and Latin literature as well as English literature, and chatting with his neighbors. Only 2 of Thoreau's many books were published while he was still alive. Walden, or Life in the Woods in 1854 and A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers in 1849. From Thoreau's diaries, manuscripts, and letters, his friends edited the works for the subsequent volumes. For one day, Thoreau chose to spend the night in jail rather than pay his poll tax, which he argued backed slavery and the Mexican-American War, while on a supply run in Concord. In possibly his most famous article, Civil Disobedience, he stated his view on the matter, 1849. A new style of protest that was later adopted by Indian leader Mohandas Gandhi as a strategy against the British and by American civil rights activists battling racial segregation in the 1960s, the essay discussed the concept of passive resistance. Other than fiction, Thoreau penned numerous non-fiction works dedicated to documenting the natural splendor of the United States and Canada. Thoreau became ill with tuberculosis in 1835 and was bedridden for several years. He was struck down with bronchitis in 1860, and his health continued to deteriorate. He eventually became bedridden and spent the last years of his life rewriting and editing all of his unpublished writings. In 1862, Thoreau passed away at the age of 44, on May 6. He was laid to rest in Concord, Massachusetts' Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, where he is buried to this day. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.